So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about homebrewing lambic. And, there's a lot of information out there about what some of the lambic producers are doing. We'll maybe touch on a little bit of what other people are doing, but mostly we're going to focus on what you do to do it at home, and mostly focus on what you do it if you're a member of Society de Lambic. And just for the record, if you pay your dues and you're a Society of Barley Engineers member, you're also automatically a member of Society de Lambic. And so you should take advantage of this because we're making some of the best lambic beers that are around, right here in San Diego County. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that. Okay, so first thing I want to tell you a little bit about is some of the terminology. Um, let's talk about sour beer. What is sour beer? Sour beer is, by definition, it's an acidic and it's tart. And the sour beers come from the fact that they have an inclusion of lactic acid, coming from lactic bacteria. Sometimes I guess it could just be added, or sometimes it's coming from the fermentation. Wild ale would refer to a beer that's fermented by microbes other than traditional brewer's yeast. Sometimes they're sour, sometimes they're not, or sometimes they have different levels of sourness. Funky is another term you might hear quite often, and that refers to things that are sort of, fruity. And with the lambic, you'll hear terms like barnyard or horse leather. These are notes that are derived from Brett fermentation. Acetic is generally one that we want to stay away from in lambic production. You'll see this in small quantities. You'll see this as a flavor that is desirable in some beers, like a Flanders Red. Like if you've ever tried the Duchess, that one's got actually quite a bit of acetic flavor to it, and it comes from it's a vinegar flavor that comes from the presence of oxygen in your fermentation. So this is, if you stay away from oxygen in lambic production, then you won't see acetic flavors. Acetic flavors are not desirable in lambics. It's one of the drawbacks of some lambics that you try that are homemade, where they have acetic character to them because they've allowed too much oxygen. Another term you may have heard is spontaneous fermentation. And so spontaneous fermentation refers to fermentation without pitching controlled samples of microbes. So it's something that's in the wood, it's something that's in the air, it's something that's that you picked up naturally from the terroir, and those are oftentimes a little bit more difficult than actually controlled fermentation, because you're letting things just go in a certain sense. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the ingredients that go into a lambic production. First and foremost, we talk about the microbes, because every beer style has their ingredient that's most important for it. When you think of IPAs, you think about how important the hops are for the IPA. When you think about a lambic, it's really the microbes that you care the most about. Yes, the other things are important, but this is really the key to it. And so this is what yeast and bacteria that you use for fermentation that contribute to the sourness and also to the funkiness that are characteristic to that flavor. The grist, the malt that you use, basically is there to provide food for the microbes. And oftentimes you use unmalted grains because they have residual starches that are left over, complex starches that are hard for the yeast and the lactobacillus to easily eat, and they can last for longer periods of time, where you would see other microbes like Brettanomyces working on them. With hops, usually in a sour beer, you want hops at a very low bitterness level. Hop bitterness and sourness, they don't combine real well, and they tend to stack on top of each other. So if you had a bitter beer that was also sour, it would taste more sour. or it would taste, or if you had a sour beer that was more bitter, it would taste more bitter, either way. And so usually you try to inhibit the lactobacillus fermentation using hops. That's one of the ways you can do it, so that you don't end up with a beer that's overly sour. And then water, which I would say is just not a real key ingredient for sour beers. You know, when we take a look at the 4 main ingredients in beer, that one I would probably put down at the bottom. By the way, if you guys have any questions along the way, just feel free to, you know, let me know, speak up and let me know, and we'll handle questions as they come up. If you want to wait till the end, that's okay too. We can wait till the end and I can answer all the questions there. We'll have a nice Q&A session at the end.
Andy, can you go to the slide before? I have a question.
Yeah.
There's wild ale and then spontaneous ferment. So what's the difference between those? Or
well, you could make a wild ale with non-traditional brewer's yeast. You know, so if you're using bread and you're using different, you know, kind of an amalgamate of different things, you could be planning to do it that way. It's not spontaneous if you're pitching the yeast, but the spontaneous fermentation is something where you're not actually going to go in and pitch the yeast. You're going to let it go. Basically, you got to collect all the yeast from some other source than, you know, your nice, you know, yeast growth, where you've grown it all up you know, on a stir plate and then pitched it all in.
okay, I got it. Yeah, well, kind of almost ambient and environmental.
Yeah, it's a little bit, you know, it's riskier. It's a riskier way to go, but sometimes you might get some things that you wouldn't get, some character you wouldn't get otherwise.
Yeah, a story of the spontaneous Alaska Brewing Company took some wort on top of some mountain, you know, in Alaska. This is a true story. And they just let it sit up there for a week and absorbed all the ambient Alaska, you know, microflora floating in the air. And interesting story there.
Yeah, the word I didn't put in there for one of the terms is terroir. You'll hear that oftentimes, and that is sort of like the character of the local region. You know, so when you have an open fermentation that occurs in Alaska, and you're basically trying to bring in the terroir, the character of the local region into the beer that you're making. So let's talk about the microbes, at least the main players. There are a lot of other ones that you may see that play a smaller role. This is the main cast right here. So Saccharomyces, that's the beer yeast that we're most familiar with. That's for most brewing. And that one is responsible for the primary fermentation for most beers. And also it's a lot of times the main fermenter that you would use for, usually I would say main fermenter that you would use for lambic production. And then you have Brettanomyces, which is known for creating funky or fruity flavors, depending on which strain of Brettanomyces. You have to understand there's many different strains of Brettanomyces and they don't all create the same flavors. And so, for example, if you have ever had Orval, that's a great beer. It's got some great fruity flavors and it has some Brettanomyces in it, but you don't taste any of that barnyard funk that you get in a lambic because it's got a different strain of Brettanomyces in it. And it's more of a fruity strain. And so the strain that we want to use for lambics is the Lambica strain. Well, so you won't go wrong. You'll know because of the name, but that's the strain that's associated with barnyard funk and you know, that type of flavor that you get. And so important for your lambic that you include that strain in there. If you want to include some of the other Brett strains in, you can, but you should have some of the Lambica strain. And then there's lactobacillus, and this is the bacteria that's responsible for creating lactic acid tartness. You know, like you would get in a yogurt, something like that. That's where that kind of a tartness. And it's very easy to go overboard with the sourness or that tartness. If you let it go, that will just take your beer out so tart you can't even drink it. And so a lot of what we do as lambic producers is to try to figure out how to inhibit the lactobacillus. We want some of it there. We want some of that tartness, but we don't want it to be overpowering. And some of the best lambics that you try, if you try a lot of the commercial ones, the Cantillons of the world, these beers are very well balanced and they have some tartness to them, but you don't look at them and think, wow, that's just, a super tart beer. That's not your first thought when you're trying one of their lambics. And so one of the mistakes I often see in a lot of lambic brewers is that the beers will end up being overly tart, like really super puckeringly tart. And that's something that you really want to try to avoid in lambic production. Another one is Pediococcus, and that's a bacteria that creates lactic acid and other byproducts. It's the one that's known for creating the ropiness that you see in beers. Sometimes you see the beer, and sometimes lambic producers will say, "Oh, that beer is sick," meaning that you should, just sit and wait for it to, get through its sickness, and then it sort of clears up a little bit. The recommendation is not to use that without Brettanomyces, and it's because it produces the diacetyl, and the Brettanomyces will eat that all up and convert it, and so you won't get it in the beer. But you really wouldn't want to have a lambic that had a diacetyl in it. That's a sort of a buttery or butterscotch flavor that you get. It's not really desirable, I think, really in any beers. Some maybe will accept it to a certain extent, but it's not something that you really strive for in any beer. We don't, in our program, we don't use Pediococcus. If it's there in some of the cultures, we accept it, but we don't target it as something that we really want to have in our the lambics that we produce. We focus mostly on the Saccharomyces, Brettanomyces, and Lactobacillus. And then Acetobacter, this actually isn't the main player because this is something you don't want in your beers. And I've had some beers that have turned acetic, and basically it always comes from, exposure to oxygen. And so as long as you don't have, even those barrels that we have out, and barrels have a little bit of breathing space, and so you get a little bit of oxygen, they don't turn acetic. And they can sit out there for months and months and months, and they won't turn acetic. But if you have a keg, a beer in a keg that has where it's lost its pressure and it's sitting there for a few months, a good chance you're going to end up with some acetic flavors to them. And if you do, don't worry too much. It might be a great beer for blending to make Flanders style beer or something like that, and maybe small quantities depending on how acetic it really is. I've had some that have turned so acetic that it's almost like the only thing it's really good for is salad dressing. So you want to stay away from that in lambic production. Okay, let's get to the fun stuff now. Let's talk about how other people are doing this, and then we'll talk about how we're doing it. And so this is sort of a map of how Cantillon does their production. They're a spontaneous fermentation production house. And so they'll brew their wort. Then they go into an open air wort cooling. And the myth is that, wow, okay, we're in open air, we're cooling this thing down in open air. And then you know what? All of these microbes are coming in here when we cool this all down. But there are some studies that they did at Cantillon to go, swab for microbes on the, in the cooling area, on the, the vents that go out on the roof and in various different places, and they really didn't find those microbes that are responsible for all that great Cantillon flavor. And so my thinking on this really is that the microbes are really in the barrels. This thing is, can open air cool it, and yeah, maybe you pick up something, but really really everything that's all the goodness that's creating and everything that you want is already in the barrels. And so, of course, the barrels get reused. And like any good brewery, you if you have a barrel that doesn't produce lambic or doesn't produce whatever kind of beer you're trying to make, doesn't produce it very well, then you decide that that barrel is going to end up getting pitched. It's going to end up going and being used for firewood. And so you can use what we call forced selection to actually create the right environment for the beer you're trying to make. And I think over the years, I think that's how that people have created their beers out of barrels that have some certain characteristics that are important to that beer. It's through forced selection by taking a barrel and saying, well, if I don't like the beer that came out of that barrel, then that's a bad barrel, and you start favoring the ones that you do like. And so, how do those barrels get seeded in the first place? Yeah, it's probably from the open air wort cooling, but I think it's more complicated, and I think most of the microbes are residing in the barrels. So after they ferment in the barrels, then they will go and do blending or fruiting or whatever they're doing for that particular Cantillon beer, and then it'll go into bottling. And so that's the production process for Cantillon.
Andy, do they add any additional, special mix, proprietary mix of microbes to the barrels, or are they relying just on whatever is resident in the barrel to just do it?
Whatever's resident in the barrel, as far as I know, because it's spontaneous fermentation, so they're not just, growing something up and pitching it. And so, as far as I know, that's the way that they're doing it.
Okay.
Let's talk about another.
Andy, is there any, for the barrels, are they emptying them to a certain extent and then topping them up like kind of a Solera method?
No, I don't believe they're doing Solera, but as with all barrels, there's, in wood, there's, all kinds of things can live in there, and they're not taking the barrels and, sanitizing them and sterilizing them and doing all that kind of stuff. They're reusing the barrels is what they're doing. And so, you have all those nooks and crannies for everything to, reside in, and that's where you get a lot of the, the microbes that are responsible for the fermentation.
A quick question. So these barrels don't go through any particular curation process, right? It's just plain new.
Well, I'm sure they do something with the barrels. When they bring a new barrel into the mix, I'm sure they do something with it. If you've ever used, they may get their barrels used from somewhere else. I don't know, but I mean, if you've ever used a new barrel, it has a very pronounced oak flavor to it, and that's not something that's desirable in the lambics. So typically, the barrels are used for storage and not for character, if that makes any sense. Back in these days, they didn't have vats and vessels that could hold all this stuff. Barrels were the way they held beer. And if you have an older barrel, it's not going to have all of that oakiness to it that you would get in a new barrel. So those are something that generally try to stay away from. So I'm not sure exactly what their process is for taking a new barrel and then being able to introduce it into the mix here. But it's certainly not just using new barrels in the, unless they used one new barrel out of 1,000, maybe they could do that. But it's not a large quantity of new barrels coming into the mix. Yeah, so let's talk about another famous brewery here, of beers that we like. This is at Russian River. If you guys are familiar with Russian River, they make some great IPAs, but they also have a great wild ale program. And their process is that they will brew basically a clean beer. You see how I have the pictures of all the stainless steel here. You're brewing a beer like you would classically brew it. You ferment it like a regular beer with Belgian yeast in it. So basically you've just got this Belgian finished beer here. And then now you stick it into the barrel. And then you add the Brettanomyces and the lactic. You actually add the Brettanomyces first. You let that have a head start. And then later, 8 to 12 weeks later, you'll add the lactic acid. You'll add some lactic acid to it to give it some tartness to it. But you're not really you're not adding this lactobacillus and giving it a lot of things to work with. And so they're able to control the tartness of it. And, that's their method for controlling the tartness of it. Cantillon, the method for controlling the tartness is they use a very large quantity of aged hops. And aged hops tend to inhibit lactobacillus fermentation. And so the reason why they use aged hops is so they don't have any bitterness. But they use a large quantity so that they'll use the antiseptic properties of the hops to inhibit the fermentation. So 2 different methods for doing this, completely different methods for coming out with, basically sour beers. Now let's talk about a third method here. And this is the method that we use here at Société de Lambic. And that is we do a group homebrew session, basically beer brewed on a number of different systems. And then those all go into our fermenters. We have fermenters that are barrels, and we have one fermenter that's a giant tote. And then we pitch everything simultaneously. We'll pitch a house culture, which is basically leftover from previous fermentations. So that's something that's carried over year to year. And that consists of Saccharomyces, Brett, and Lacto. And then we add a fresh pitch of Saccharomyces. And the idea is that the Saccharomyces, the regular brewer's yeast, is going to get a good head start. Since it's fresh, it's ready to go, it's going to start eating up all the sugars so that there won't be as much for the lactobacillus to chew on. And we also add Brettanomyces lambicus, because even though the house culture has that in it, it just seems like we can never have too much Brett flavor in our lambic. So we're always add fresh pitches of Brettanomyces lambicus, or Brett L as they sometimes call it. So those will ferment, and we let those go typically we go for 6 months. During COVID, we've been going for 9 months. And we then at the end of the 6 months, we basically pull them out and we'll keg everything that's there. And the key is that when we pull all the beer out of it's not a big deal for the tote, but for the barrels, when we pull the beer out of the barrels, we fill the barrels back up with something else. So we usually have one brew session in March where we brew 300 or 400 gallons. I mean, we're filling up all the barrels and the tote. And then at the end of that, when we harvest in the fall, we will, everyone will have a chance to pull kegs out, and then we will have some beer that's brewed to add right back into the kegs just to fill up the barrels. Not the tote. The tote, we'll leave that dry because we can clean the tote out, but we can't clean the oak out. It's much more difficult to do that. So we don't want to let our oak sit dry. And then once we've kegged those things, people will hang on to those things. They can either blend with them, or they can drink them straight, or they can add fruit to it. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's done later on in the presentation. Is there any question about this process, about any of the 3 processes?
How many rounds have you done, over the years, on this production?
I would say somewhere on the order of 30, something like that. Maybe 30 batches of this we've done as a group over the years.
And have you arrived at pretty much the same, contributions of your house culture and your sack and Brett, what have you learned over time, and has that
Yeah,
changed?
that's a really good question, Jack. So the thing is, one of the things that I noticed over, we used to just pitch all these things at the same time. And one of the things that I noticed was that some of the beers were coming out more sour than we really wanted them to be. They're tartar than we wanted them. And when you compare them against Cantillon, you're going, well, it's a good beer, but it's pretty tart. And so what we did is we changed how we do we were just pitching everything. We changed how we do the Saccharomyces, and we do a much bigger, healthier pitch of Saccharomyces. So that gives it a bigger head start. We always use some hops, aged hops in our mix too. But having the healthy pitch of Saccharomyces really helped to soften the flavors out in the end. So that was one thing that was learned. I mean, there were a lot of things learned about on the production side of things, like what we do now, which is we have people that can help out to make up hot water to help people so that they can do 2 back-to-back brew sessions real easily because somebody's made up some hot water for them. We have like a group setting a group barrel that we run filtered water into, so the water is all ready to go, filtered. People don't have to do anything with it. We organize and we get all the ingredients ahead of time, so those can be just weighed out and put into the brew system. So we make it really easy, and we've got people in different jobs so that we can be efficient as a group rather than just everybody doing their own thing as an individual. So yeah, some things that have been learned in the process.
Thanks.
Let's talk a little bit about controlling the tartness. I did allude to this a little bit, but this is how the tartness is controlled. Just to really put a point in it, this is how it's controlled for Cantillon, is that they use a large amount of hops. It's about 0.6 ounces per gallon to inhibit the lactobacillus. And also, we talked about maintaining barrels that produce the best beer. For Russian River, of course, I talked about how they don't add the lactic acid until 8 to 12 weeks after Brett fermentation. And so that way they've got all the fermentation done, even some of the Brett character in there before they add lactic acid. And that way they can ensure that you don't have lactobacillus or anything that's going to get in there that's going to eat up anything else. And the way we do it is that larger pitch of healthy Saccharomyces. So basically it's sort of a racing condition. We allow the Saccharomyces to go faster than the other ones. And so what'll typically happen is the Saccharomyces will ferment that down. And in a week, you've got something that is fermented down with Saccharomyces down to what you would normally see for for an ale on terminal gravities. And then that's when the lactobacillus and the Brettanomyces start kicking in over a longer period of time. We also use aged hops. We're at about 0.4 ounces per gallon, which is a good amount. We don't feel like we want to do any more than that because it starts having problems, with people dealing with that quantity of hops in their boiling kettle.
When are those aged hops added?
So you add it right in the boiling kettle like you would any other beer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andy, were you particular about using whole leaf hops or pellets?
Yeah, in the old days, I used whole leaf hops because the nice part about whole leaf is because they'll be easier to age that because they have more surface area contact with oxygen. And typically I would take these and I put them up in my attic where in the summer times it gets really hot. Mostly what we're using is hops that have been aged for at least 3 years. But now it's really hard to get whole leaf hops that are debittered. And so I normally just get debittered pellet hops and I let those sit. They're already debittered, but I still let them sit up in the attic for 3 years just because I can. And those are readily available. You can buy them that way. So if you really wanted to just brew it, you could just buy the debittered hops and just go. You don't have to, supposedly you don't have to age them at all. I feel a little bit better aging it for a little bit.
Hey, Andy, I was just curious do you have any sense of like how debittered they are? Like how many IBUs are actually going into the...
It's supposed to be 0.
Wow.
And the truth of the matter is that if you talk to the folks over at Russian River, they say that you don't have to have 0. The hops will degrade. You know, you guys know all about hop creep and things like that. They'll degrade anyway. So as long as you have something that's just low, you know, so I think they said something like, you know, you want to be under 20 IBUs. If you got under 20 IBUs in your beer and you're aging this thing for a longer period of time, your hops are going to, your hop bitterness is going to go down to 0. So.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious about the inhibition level of the lacto, because I was thinking that the alphas would probably be contributing to the inhibition of the alphas, but maybe there's other stuff in there that also inhibits them.
Yeah, I don't know that it's the. I don't think it's the alpha acid that's contributing to the inhibition. It's the other antiseptic properties of the hops, which is why you debitter them, and you still have the antiseptic properties. So it's
okay.
not alpha acids. There's something else in the hops. I'm not exactly sure what. Let's talk a little bit about microbe preparation. So this is what we end up doing with the microbes. We have a house culture that we'll end up using that gets propagated from year to year. And then, as I mentioned before, the bread elk cultures, we'll get those cultures from white labs or elsewhere. We'll grow those up. If you're growing up pure cultures like bread elk, you can grow those up and you can get more of them. If you're growing up a mixed culture, then whatever you grow up is probably not going to be the same mix as what you were given to start out with. And so something to be aware of if you're used to using mixed cultures, they won't all grow at the same rate. And then for good luck, we end up dumping bottle dregs of lambics that we like, that we're drinking during the brewing process. Those will end up going into the fermenters. And I'm sure there's not much of a contribution there, but it always feels good to take one of those classic, really nice beers that you really liked and giving a little bit of a good luck charm to your beer that you've made. And so in the end, this is what it looks like. This is one of the Lambic brew sessions that we've had. You can see there's all kinds of activity going out there, people brewing with all kinds of different setups. And one of the things I will say that's really nice about this kind of a brew session is that you get a chance to walk around and see what other people are doing. So you can see, people are using quick brew processes, people are using 3-tier brewing systems, all kinds of different systems. And I can tell you, every time I do this, I walk around and every time I learn something from somebody. There's always something to be learned about, what people have done and how they're doing things differently. And the cool thing is it doesn't really matter. All the things end up going into the same vessels when we ferment them. So let's talk about the jobs that we have. We have people that are brewing. We have people that are doing just water prep, meaning that you're getting the filtered water and heating it up so the brewers have brewing water. We have people that are responsible for just handling the wort chilling. So we've got a wort chiller that goes around, and somebody's got to figure out how to get that connected and to people's brew systems and be able to pump it all out so we can pump it into the fermenter. And then there's usually somebody up with the barrels that is tending to the barrels and making sure that they're all getting filled. So it's sort of a group effort. Somebody's weighing, we can have help weighing and grinding grains out. So the idea is that we can put everyone to work. And so even if you're not planning on brewing that day and you come out, we're going to put you to work, and you'll be doing something to support the cause. So let me tell you a little bit about the recipe that we're using. We've sort of settled on this and used this for the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years. But it's a classic mix of 70-30 for malted barley to unmalted flaked wheat. We use as I mentioned, the debittered hops, a large amount of debittered hops. And then the water, which isn't as important, we just use the filtered water from Vista. And I mentioned the other microbes that we're adding to. Sometimes we add other blends. Sometimes people come up and say, "I have a blend of different Brett's that I could add to it," and we go, "Yeah, let's do it. Let's add to it." And so that's typically what we end up doing. For the recipe, and the process, Brewing Lambic is kind of a story about, doing everything the wrong way, everything different than what you've been taught as a brewer. So as a brewer, you've been taught, to use fresh hops. You've been taught to do, to sparge at lower temperatures. And we just do everything differently for lambics. And so we are mashing at very high temperatures. We sparge at a high temperature. And the reasons for that is that we're basically trying to make something that's super starchy. And the starches will be harder to ferment, and they'll leave a little bit more there for the Brett to work off of later in the fermentation cycle. We pitch all the microbes together. We ferment for 6 months. That's basically how we do it. Is there any question about the whole brewing process?
How do you know when, you're at that 6-month point, where you're really done? Is it taste?
That's a good question. So you can do one of two things. You can either say, well, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to sample the beer and see how it's coming along. We don't do that. We just cross our fingers and we say, everybody's coming over. They're all going to collect kegs of this stuff. I hope it's good. Because what I don't want to do is just unnecessarily introduce oxygen into the system. And so we've done it that way all these years, and we've not had a problem. I think one year, maybe 10 years ago, we had one barrel that lost its seal and it went acetic. But other than that, we've never had any problems with it. So we maintain the seal, maintain the closure of the vessels, and let it go. And we trust the microbes to do their job.
Wow, that's great discipline. I don't think I'd have that kind of discipline to stay away.
Well, I'll tell you, it does make you a little bit nervous on, when you have all these people coming over to collect all the lambic. Makes you nervous about what you're going to find out. But it's been successful so many times in a row that, we're feeling like that's the right way to do things.
Better knock on wood, Andy.
Yeah. So,
knock on a barrel.
Knock on the barrel.
Right.
Okay.
How long have you used the same barrels? Another question.
Yeah, so we've got those barrels fairly recently, like in, I think maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. We've had those for 5 to 7 years. We used to do everything in plastic barrels. And we've got those wood barrels fairly recently. And then we also got that giant tote, which was kind of nice to have a big giant tote that you could do a large volume in. That was a fairly recent addition also.
Yeah,
So,
were those wine barrels?
Those are wine barrels, actually. So the first time we used them, I was real nervous because they had I don't know, Cabernet in them or something, a red wine in them. So they were very stained, and I was thinking my lambic's going to come out stained. And we cleaned them out as best we could, but of course that stain was still there. And in the end, we didn't get any, stain. We might have got some, good character and notes and stuff from the wine that was in there, but we didn't get any unnecessary color or unwanted color from it. One year, I will tell you a story though. One year Jim Bordier brought back a bunch of barrels from Ballast Point that Patrick had arranged for us to get. And we took one of those barrels and we used it, and we put lambic in it. And it had Victory at Sea in it, which, if you guys are familiar with Victory at Sea, it's a big imperial stout. And the stuff that was coming out, the dregs from the barrels that we had an opportunity to try, were tasting so good. They were really good. But we just ended up, just for experimental purposes, deciding to put lambic into it just to see what would happen. And the lambic came out sort of spicy, peppery flavor to it, which was really interesting. I think it was kind of from the coffee notes that were in there from the beer. And what we ended up doing, I ended up playing off of that and adding some poblanos to a lambic and making a poblano lambic that went out to the festival. That was a big hit that one year. And so sometimes you can experiment with these things too.
Cool.
Hey, Andy, how's
Yeah.
that 5-gallon slurry barrel doing? It's been probably 7-8 years now.
Yeah, it's a good point. We have a Solera going. And so we have a small barrel that's, I think it's somewhere between 5 and 7 gallons. And what we do is every year we'll empty out part of that, 2/3 of it, leave a third of it in there, and then add on top of it. And so that we keep that going from year to year. And then what we do is, when you come out for the lambic brew session, we're actually going to have the ability to drink lambic straight from the cask. And so we hook up a dispensing system so we can draw straight from the cask and drink, Solera lambic that's been basically Solera-sized for the last 10 years. So, yeah, so that's pretty good. That's a good thing that's going on. Let's talk a little bit about fruiting lambic. A lot of people ask me questions about this. Well, what's the best way to fruit lambic? And I'll tell you the process that I'm using. And there are a number of different processes, and I'll talk a little bit after this about some of the tips. But my process is really, I'm a big fan of frozen fruit. And the reason why, there's a couple reasons. One is, frozen fruit can be picked when it's freshest. You can freeze it when it's in its best condition. And oftentimes, when you have fruit in a market, people have to make a calculation about, do they pick the fruit before it's ripe so it'll travel right? What do they do to it so that it will travel and appear right when it shows up in the store? And you don't have that with frozen fruit. And the other thing is, because the freezing process breaks open all the cell walls, and so it allows the sugars and all the flavors to be able to get into your beer a little bit easier. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of frozen fruit. So mostly, if I have the option to, I'm mostly using frozen fruit. And what I do is, I will add frozen fruit to a lambic. I'll usually choose one that I think, okay, this would be a good one for fruiting. One thing you have to be careful about is, if you're adding some fruits like that have a lot of citric acid to them, that they'll tend to come out tartar. And so you may want to pick a lambic base that's less tart, knowing that you're going to have a lot of citric acid that's going to be added to the beer in the process. If the lambic I'm using has been aged for longer than 6 months, then I will typically add some fresh yeast to it, because what you want is, you want the fruit to ferment. You want the flavor from the fruit, but you don't want the sweetness and the cloyiness. You want it to all ferment out. And so what you'll want to make sure that there's either yeast that's still active in the beer, or you'll want to add some active yeast for that. And you can do that, let it ferment for, I say 1 to 2 months, but realistically it's probably 3 or 4 weeks. It's probably done. I just let it go a little longer. There's not really any harm. And then you rack the beer, and then you're done. You've got a fruited beer.
What
Um,
kind of yeast are you adding at this point?
the yeast is not really that important. So Lambic is a pretty low alcohol beer, and so you don't have to find something that's super alcohol tolerant. So usually it's whatever. If I've got some yeast I'm working with because I'm fermenting another beer, I'll use that. If not, I might use champagne yeast or something like that. What's in the fruit is simple sugars, and so it's easy. It's going to be pretty easy for the yeast to ferment that out. So it's not.
It's a sack. It's a sack strain.
Yeah, I typically would use a sack strain just because it's more efficient.
Got it.
Efficient way to do it. A few tips about brewing sour or about fruiting sour beers, and one of them is if you're going to age a beer, age the beer before you fruit it. So the ideal thing is that you have an aged lambic, and then you added fresh fruit to it. Well, that's a really good lambic. And as the fruit ages, I don't see a lot of benefit to it as it ages. Whereas with a lambic, as it ages, I generally see a lot of good benefits to them. So that's sort of one tip. What amount of fruit should you use? And that will depend on the type and the format. And so some things that don't have a lot of flavor to them, you may have to add, a couple pounds per gallon just to get anything to come out of it. And other ones, that are stronger flavored, you have to add maybe a half a pound per gallon. So maybe a lot less. So I would say kind of anywhere between a half a pound and 2 pounds per gallon. Those would be sort of a general rule of thumb, but it would depend on the fruit that you're doing. We talked about, the benefits of frozen fruit. I usually will crush the frozen fruit. I know you maybe don't need to do that because it's frozen, but it depends on how easy you think it is for it to access everything in the fruit. And it's pretty easy when they're frozen to crush them. So I usually do that. Stick them in a mesh bag to be able to separate them. I can't tell you how many times we have somebody bringing a lambic to the festival and we put it on tap and it won't come out of the tap because there's some, fruit that's clogged up the dispensing tube. So
and that's no fun when we're trying to serve lambics at the
generally
festival.
what happens if that happens is the first thing is take that one off and put another one on, and then call the brewer over here and try to figure out, you sort this out, try to figure this out. And it's probably not something you want to be trying to figure out at the festival. So best thing to do is to use mesh bags to make sure you separate the fruit from the beer. So you can take that bag out. I usually put a weight in there. I've got these nice little cue balls I've been using over the years that will weight it down so that I can make sure it's underneath the surface. It's in contact with the beer. Adding fresh yeast, we talked about racking off prior to serving, and we talked about the high acidity that you can get from some fruits. And so I think that's really it for fruiting. Does anybody have any questions about fruiting beer?
Question for you.
Yeah.
Is there a difference or a big difference or any difference whatsoever between, let's say, using frozen fruit, smashed into a bag versus, let's say, using the same fruit, but, using something like the, Vitamix equipment to really fine, grind the whole fruit in a way that you just pour the whole thing into it, and the particles are going to be so small that they will not clog any tube or exits.
You don't really want that.
Yeah,
I don't think you really want the meat of the fruit. You want the juice and
I think
the fermented juice.
Pulverizing the fruit, or like turning it into juice, that you could actually add juice, and there are other ways to do that. But I think it's good to be able to separate the some of these things like, you have seeds in raspberries and things like that. You want to keep those things separated. You don't want them to end up in your keg. Once you're serving this, you want it to just be liquid without anything that could clog it up. So generally, try not to do that, something like that.
Yeah, you really don't want the pulp. You want the juice from the fruit. So that's where you would end up with potential problems and some off flavors, especially with things that have seeds and could add tannins and things like that.
Got it.
So let's talk a little bit about, yeah, go ahead.
One quick question. Are there some fruits that you've used that really don't work very well and to avoid?
Well, some fruits are really hard to get flavors out of. And so if those fruits that are really delicate are really hard to get flavors out of, sometimes those don't work because you have to put so much of them in there. And I know I think some people have had some dragon fruit beers that have been pretty good, but to me, dragon fruit is really hard to get that flavor out of. You need a lot of it. Other fruits, I think some fruits, like I have a really nice one that's an apple lambic, but you have to be careful because if you have to add a lot of apple to get the apple flavor to it, and with that you're getting a lot of tartness from acetic acid.
Got it. Yeah, I've heard some people have problems with strawberries. It's such a light fruit. You have to add so much and all
That's
the
another one.
and it doesn't come through. So
yes,
typical cherry, raspberry, peach, is probably.
Yeah, strawberries are very light. Yes, you can do it. I've done it before, but I've done it maybe 4 or 5 times. And I think one time it came out fantastic. And one time it came out okay. And then 2 of the times it didn't do much. And so it depends on the quality of the fruit, depends on how much flavor they have. A lot of times you get these fruits and you go, if you're sampling the fruit and it doesn't have a lot of flavor to it, then, you got to wonder how well it's going to work in your beer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, blending lambic. We'll talk about blending and then, I think we're going to get into questions after we do blending. So this is going to lead right into the blending session that we're going to have. Obviously, we're going to be doing a brewing session, and we're also going to be doing a blending session. And the question really is, why do we blend? And for lambics, the reason why we blend is to develop complexity. And you can make something that is more complex than any of the constituents. Better beer than any of the constituents individually by putting them all together as a whole. And so what that does is it'll broaden the flavors. It creates this sort of layering that you get of flavors. And then it allows you to basically build the character that you want to taste. And so I'm a big fan of blending. I think I'm surprised we don't use blending in beer making that much to begin with, because it's such a powerful tool to be able to say, I've got this beer, even like say a stout, I've got this stout here and I've got this stout here. And this one's got, a lot of chocolate in it. This one's got, some coffee notes to it. If I blend them together in the right, the right formula, then maybe I get something that's better than each of them individually. I'm surprised we don't do that more often as homebrewers. I'm a big fan of this, and, it's not that hard to do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process that I use to blend. And this is the process that we'll be doing, if you guys come out to this blending session for lambic. The first thing you do is you blend into a glass. You don't just go, oh, I think I'm going to blend this and just put it all into a keg, because you've got nowhere to go. So, and what typically happens when you start blending things into a glass is things that you thought would work, they don't work so well. And you try this and you go, oh, that's not what I wanted. Maybe a little bit more of this. And so, dump that out and try something else. Dump that out and try something else. And so you're doing a lot of trials. And so you want to do that, literally with a gram scale, measuring things, very small quantities, the bottom of a small cup, a small glass, a tasting glass. you know, because you can go through so many different ideas by doing that. And then once you get a formulation, you basically want to, you know, do it by weight so that you can actually build that formulation. So you see step one blended into the glass. Once you figure out what you want, step two is then you're going to scale it up. You're going to blend it in a keg. And then step three is, you know, because normally you're doing this and all your beers that you're blending with are at room temperature and they're not carbonated when you're just sort of mixing stuff. So chill it, carbonate it, taste it, and then make whatever final adjustments that you want. So those are just kind of the 3 steps. So let's now talk about step 0. Step 0 is build an inventory of lambics for blending. This will take you a number of years. You can actually see some of these that are labeled 2013, and there's one that's labeled 2011. So there's lambics from a number of different years that are here that are available. And I have basically somewhere around 25 kegs of that they're available for lambic, and most all of them are filled with something, and they're all different. And having things that are different gives you the ability to taste them and decide how they might blend together. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 steps. Step 1A, sample the kegs before blending. So, and you'll see this, the first thing that you'll do that will tell you to do if you come out for the lambic blending session is to basically everything will have a number on it. Go taste it and write down something on a piece of paper that just says, you know, a general description of it, just a short thing that would jog your memory to tell you about remind you about what that beer is that you tasted. You know, does it have, is it super funky? Is it, oh, it's super tart. It's really tart. Oh, it's real mellow. Oh, it doesn't have a lot of character, or it has this, you know, it has this flavor in here that's funny flavor. And you write those things down. So you've tasted them all. And then once you do that, you can decide which kegs that you want to blend with. And normally for lambic blending that we'll do in that session, we'll say that you shouldn't really blend with any more than 5 kegs. There's not really any point to adding, you know, 17 different things into a beer. With 5, you can get all the complexity that you need. So usually it's 3 to 5 is what you do. And then we have a rule that we say we don't want any blend to have more than 50% of any given beer. And mostly we do that so that we can make sure that we have enough to be able to blend it all up once we do figure out that formulation. So a lot of times people do this and they say, well, I'm going to have one beer that's sort of a base, and then one beer that's going to be, that's going to add some balance to it, and another beer that's going to add some character to it. So you can, you know, the different beers that you mix in there can have different jobs, you know, and then you mix them all in there to get something that is better than any of the individual constituents. And this is what it looks like when you are formulating by weight. So you can see we have these small glasses, we have these balances, we're measuring things and basically deciding by weight, you know, 5 grams of this, 7 grams of this, you know, literally small volumes to be able to get to something that we think is the magic formulation. Once you do that and you have the magic formulation, if you've done it by weight, we should just be able to scale it right up by weight. And so we can scale it right up and fill a keg up. We usually we might fill the keg up to maybe 4 gallons. This one right here is probably filled a little high right here, unless that's just foam that's on the top there. But if you leave it to 4 gallons and you have another gallon to play with, then you have a chance to adjust it once it's chilled and carbonated. So that's sort of step 3. Then you chill and carbonate it. Then you will sample it again and adjust it by addition. So that's basically the blending process in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions about the blending process?
So Andy, do you Chill and carbonate on blending day? You able to get it chilled
No.
and carved? You got to wait for that.
No, you got to wait for that.
Yeah.
So for the blending day that we do, that's step we sort of skip it. You know, we do things a little bit differently. We'll actually blend it up to just a growler, and then we'll taste the growlers and we'll basically judge it. And the people that are there will judge it, and we'll pick one growler to represent our club, and then we'll scale that up to 5 gallons and bring that out to the fest. So we don't have that opportunity to sample and adjust by addition. But I do recommend this if you're doing this on your own, because when you chill and carbonate it and let it settle a little bit, it's gonna, maybe you're in a different frame of reference too. It's gonna taste a little bit differently, and you might think you want a little bit more of something else in it to just.
Yeah, well, as we were talking about earlier, temperature can have a big impact, and obviously
right.
carbonation impacts flavors as well. So
Yep.
That'd be the best way for a final judge. And like you said, give yourself an opportunity to adjust once you have that product.
So the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is bottling lambic. And here I am here with one of my buddies here, bottling some lambic. And it's kind of a fun thing to do with somebody else, especially if you're corking and caging them. It's a great way to be able to showcase a lambic when you have it in a nice lambic bottle with cork and a cage on it, and put a label on it. And so we do this. This is where you're seeing the bottles that we've just raffled off. Those have come from bottlings that we've done. I think a while back we had I set up, it was on a hot day, and so I set up a sweatshop in my garage, and I got Jacques and Todd, and I think Jim was there too, to come out to the sweatshop and work to bottle some beers. And so, so bottling can be a lot of fun. So I'd recommend doing that. Last thing is, there's some references here that I got for this, and then I guess we're down to questions, and then that's it. So any questions?
I got a question on the bottling. So is the beer's already carbonated, right? So you're not doing any bottle conditioning?
This is all bottle conditioned. So normally, like lambics would all be 100% bottle conditioned. So if you've got carbonation in your lambic, before you're gonna basically strip that carbonation out before you bottle it, and then you bottle it with sugar. And I'm glad you brought this up, because if you're brewing if you're naturally carbonating something, you can run your carbonation levels much higher than you can with your bottle counter pressure bottling or bottling with a beer gun. And typically I like to run them at higher pressures. So I will basically look for 4 volumes of CO2 on the lambics that I make. Now, if you have some traditional lambics, if a traditional straight lambic would be usually cast lambic that wouldn't be carbonated at all. And so you can do that way. But other beers like a Goose and like a lot of lambics that you will open up, they're pretty highly carbonated. And that's how you get those. You need to bottle condition those.
What kind of yeast do you add yeast for that? Bottle conditioning.
So same rule. If it's been longer than 6 months and I don't think that there's yeast in there, I will add yeast to it, fresh yeast to it. It doesn't take a lot, because it's just whatever bottling sugar you have in there you're trying to make it ferment. But I have had beers that I've bottled where they didn't carbonate. And so I've learned that you can't just take any beer and just put sugar in it and know that there's going to be yeast there that's going to ferment it out. So I actually had one year where I made a barley champagne, and I bottled it, and it didn't carbonate. And I actually took all of the bottles out. I opened them all up. I dumped them into a bottling bucket, I added sugar. No, I didn't add sugar because the sugar was already there. I added yeast, and then I rebottled them all. You know,
Wow.
yeah, pain in the butt. It worked out really good, but I learned that if you've got a beer that has been sitting around for a longer period of time, and you don't think the yeast is all that active, just add a little bit of fresh yeast. It doesn't take much, and you can just use any yeast, just dry yeast, to make it simple.
Yeah, Andy, the other thing is pH is a huge factor here. If your pH gets too low, the yeast might not like that. It'll kill them off.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And generally, these lambics have pretty low pH, and so yeah, you can.
Yeah, you'll get pH shock, and your yeast will just go away. So there's techniques around that where you prep them for the lower pH.
I know that champagne yeast typically one of the keys of it is it's good with lower pH. So the champagne yeast typically is like the best yeast to use.
The champagne yeast is good because it's good with lower pH. It's also good with, it's alcohol tolerant. A lot of yeast aren't alcohol tolerant. It's not a big deal for lambic, but if you were doing a really big beer, you were doing an imperial stout, and you just pitched a regular yeast, it might not like it that there's a lot of alcohol in there. And then the other thing is that a lot of those champagne yeast and wine yeast, they're better at fermenting simple sugars. And so for some people, they want to make sure that the only sugars that are fermented out are the sugars that they added, the simple sugars. And so the champagne yeast, champagne yeast and wine yeast tend to want to ferment simple sugars out.
I think last few times that I've bottled, I've added the bloomed champagne yeast to the bottling bucket, and then the actual bottles, there's the small, not the big carbonation tabs, but the little pellets. I've added a couple pellets per bottle depending on the pressure that I want. So like, I could drop in 4 pellets or 5 pellets, because typically I think 3 pellets is like in a 12-ounce bottle, 3 pellets is like 2.5 or 2.7. So you could drop in like, the 5 pellets or whatever, the 5 little tabs per bottle. And that way the champagne yeast will chew that simple sugar per bottle. And I found that that's really easy to kind of drop those in each bottle and have them ready.
Yeah, I've not used the pellets. I typically weigh out the sugar and stir it all around in the bottling bucket, and then bottle the whole thing together that way. But that's certainly, I know a lot of people that do it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. And my go-to is generally a champagne yeast also. I just have some dried champagne yeast that I have, that when I want to do things like that, want to bottle stuff, then I can just add it, add that in.
The champagne's yeast is pretty neutral in flavors that it produces as well, right?
Yeah, it's pretty neutral.
Very neutral, and Russian River uses DV10 for a lot of their bottle conditioning.
Any other questions?
Andy, fruity the lambic, how much fruit and how long?
How much fruit and how long? Well, it depends on the fruit that you're doing. If you told me nothing else and just said, I'm going to use a fruit and I'm not sure what it is, then I'd probably tell you, okay, go use a pound per gallon of fruit. But now you're going to tell me what kind of fruit that you're using. And, I might tell you to use more. Or if you tell me that I just want to get a touch of fruit, I don't want to get a lot of fruit flavor in there, then I might tell you less.
How about frozen peaches?
Peaches? Yeah, I would go with like a pound per gallon on the peaches. You could go even higher than that because the peaches are not going to be as strong flavored as cherries or raspberries. They tend to be stronger. So if you wanted to go higher than somewhere between 1 and 2 pounds per gallon,
So how long do you let it sit?
So I would go a minimum of probably a month. But if it's sat for a month or 2 months, yeah, you'd be good. You basically just want to make sure that it's had time to soak in there and it's had time to ferment all the sugars that are in there. And so, that's probably going to happen in, a week or two. But if you leave it for a month, then you're sure it's finished everything it's going to do.
Andy, I've got my wife's. We have a persimmon tree, and she pulled off a bunch of they were going to be too ripe to deal with. They were going to fall off and rot, so she pulled them off and froze them. Any you ever tried persimmons?
Yeah, so persimmons, I don't think are going to give you a real strong flavor. I know there's a lot of sweetness that you can get from that, but you're not just looking for the sweetness. You're really looking for. In fact, you're not really looking for the sweetness. You're really looking for the flavor that you're going to get out of the fruit. You're trying to
I tried loquats a couple of years ago, and just a ton of loquats. They don't have a really strong flavor. It was noticeable, but it wasn't it didn't pop out for sure.
Yeah, loquats is another one like that. Loquats, persimmons. There's a lot of dragon fruits that I don't think have a lot of flavor to them. They have a delicate flavor, and so it's harder to to really get the flavor out of them. And those are ones that maybe.
We got a bunch of guavas coming on the tree. That might be.
I would stay from. So guavas work really well. I don't know if you've ever tried Jeremy Jerome's guavois, he calls it. It's one of my favorite lambics. It's really nice. Other fruits I would stay away from would be citrus fruits. I would stay away from things like limes and lemons and maybe even oranges. Stay away from all those things. They're going to get real acidic, from the acid that's in the fruit, and that's not what you're going to want to. That's not what you're going to want to get.
Awesome, thanks.
Andy, you mentioned you use the frozen fruit method or format, if you will. Have you used purees?
I have before. I've used purees, I've used extracts, I've used whole fruit, and I've used dried fruit too. I used some dried apricots to do that. And so, and I come back to my first choice is really the frozen fruit. I've had the best flavors come out of that. So now if you had the right fresh fruit, I'm sure it would kick the frozen fruit's butt. If you had the right fresh fruit. It's just that I don't think that you often are able to get that. So for that reason, I'm generally a favor of the frozen fruit.
It's kind of reliability, and repeatability on your side. Yeah.
Well, just getting the amount of the flavors out of them. If you try some of those beers that are made, the fruited beers like the Creek and the Framboise, and you just get these great flavors out of it from adding some of the frozen fruit. But if you have fresh fruit and it's, I don't know how many times I've had fresh fruit where I get it and I'm like, it looks so good, and I try it and then it doesn't taste like anything. I was up in Seattle and I bought some, I was in Whole Foods and I saw these blueberries and they were so plump and they were blue and they looked so good. And I was like so excited about bringing them home and trying them that I ended up buying 2 big things of it. I brought it back and I tasted them and they were just bland as could be. There was just no flavor to them. And so hardly any flavor. And so those would be not very good ones for, for making a lambic with.
Did you take a COVID test?
What's that?
Did you take a COVID test?
Did I take a COVID test? Yeah, I did. I took a COVID test when I got up there before we visited with my parents. Actually, we all did. We all took these COVID tests. I took one down here before my family members came down to go fly up with me. And then when we got up there, we took it before we got together with the
Just making sure you're not wrongfully blaming the fruit.
No, it was not a COVID situation. It was definitely a bad fruit.
Andy, curious if you have any experience with sour soup fruit.
Yeah, so if there are some fruits that are available at Costco, and that's a reasonable way. Fruit can get really expensive, by the way. So if you get frozen fruit, the cherries that you can get from Costco, really nice cherries. They used to have raspberries. They don't You know, maybe once in a while they might get it, but I've not seen it any time recently. They used to have, one time I got peaches there that were really good. Frozen fruit from other grocery stores, peaches and things like that. And a lot of times the problem is a lot of times they come in like 1 pound bags and you're buying like a gazillion of them. So I guess it depends on how much you're actually making. But yeah, I think there's some other sources, and there's some sources up in Oregon where people get purees and things like that that they really like. I think some of the purees can be pretty good. I would stay away from the extracts. The extracts are I have not found any extracts that I think are suitable for making a really good fruit lambic. But purees can be really good. Those are a lot of times real fresh fruit. And you know, it depends on if you find some fresh fruit that you go, wow, this is the greatest fresh fruit I've ever had. These are the best fresh peaches I've ever had. They're really good. Yeah, buy up a whole bunch of them and core them and put them in. I took apples from my tree and I used those. And in the spring I had Anna apples, so I made a lambic I called Anna. And then in the fall I had Fuji apples, and so I made a lambic called Fuji. And when I made the Anna one, I had so many apples in there that literally there was more apples than there was liquid in there. So the apples couldn't even go down below all their surface of the lambic. And that ended up being too much apple. I had a lot of apple flavor, but it was just too tart for my liking. And so I cut back on it. I cut back to 2 pounds. I was over 2 pounds per gallon. I cut back to 2 pounds per gallon on the apples for the Fuji one. And that one turned out really nice. Still tartar than what you would get for a straight lambic, but real enjoyable. Sort of hybrid between a cider and a lambic. All right, last question. Anyone have a last question?
Yeah, have you ever tried anything like savory, like say like juniper berries or maybe some herbs instead of like fruit?
Oh, that's a good idea. Maybe you're starting to give me some good ideas about doing so. I mean, I like trying different things. The craziest thing I tried was that poblano lambic. I did make a lambic that I made with some dark malts. And that's kind of an interesting beer. And so you might see that one at the outrageous bottle share that we're having. So yeah. So anyways, I want to thank you guys for listening to me talk about this stuff, and hope you guys are able to participate in the Lambic brew session that we have coming up.
Yeah, that's the question I have is after this talk and looking at this picture here, how many people are thinking about bringing out their brewing equipment for Lambic Brew Day? Because it is an amazing time. You absolutely will learn something from the other brewers that are there. Even if you don't bring your own brewing system, you're welcome to come and join in the festivities and lend a hand. There's always a job. There's always work and help that can be things that you can help with. So hoping that this is an inspiration for people coming out.
Yeah, and we, as every year we do this because some people have brew systems that are not that portable. And so what we do is we say, look, you can either come out here, and I encourage you, if you can, bring your brew system out here. Some people have more than one brew system. They have one that's small portable thing, and they have one that's a bigger one that's not portable. And so they bring the small portable one out. So I encourage you to come out here and bring your brew system up there, because it makes for a great day for us all hanging out. And there's typically a lot of great beers that are shared, and we have a great time doing it, brewing beer. But if you can't do that, then you can brew at home also. We allow you to brew at home and then bring the wort out there either on this day or make special arrangements to bring it out. And typically maybe 10% of the wort that we make is brewed at other people's homes, and 90% of it is brewed here on site.
It's a pretty amazing thing to see.
Well, cool. Thank you all.
Great presentation. Thank you.